Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to this Efficiency for Access Design Challenge webinar. My name's Rachel. I use she, her pronouns. You've probably met me before, but it's great to be here and connect with you all again. Today we're going to be exploring two big, important and interrelated topics of the Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as the SDGs, and Leave No One Behind. This session is being recorded, so if you don't feel comfortable being seen or heard, please do stay on mute and keep your cameras off. You can put any questions, any comments that you have into the chat, and I can pick them up there. If you are comfortable though, it's always lovely to see your faces and hear your voices. So I encourage you to have your cameras on and come off mute to ask questions. I think people are just introducing themselves in the chat as well, which is always lovely to see. So on the agenda today, I will briefly introduce the importance of these topics to the challenge and the assessment framework. We'll have some introductions to our speakers, Kate Roll and Sheree Conibear, and we will then have a presentation from Kate on the Sustainable Development Goals and a presentation from Sheree on Leave No One Behind. And then we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A. So if you don't have questions prepared already, make sure to consider during the presentations any questions that you'd like to ask our speakers. It's always great to hear your questions. They could be generally about the topics, or they could be something that's a bit more specific to your project. So have a think as we're going through today what you'd like to ask. So the Sustainable Development Goals, you probably are all familiar with. They're a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for now into the future. And Leave No One Behind might be something that you're a bit less familiar with, but that's a really important overarching principle and goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they're very closely connected. And the way in which they relate to the assessment framework and the assessment criteria on the challenge, they go hand in hand with two of our criterion. So you can see under social impact, we've got Leave No One Behind. How well has your design considered the SDGs commitment to leave no one behind? And then under sustainability, we have contribution to SDGs. So how does your design contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? So you can see they're very closely tied to those two criterion, but they also can spread right across the rest of the criteria. And I think that's something that's really important to think about as you're working through your designs and addressing these. So for example, if you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions and environmental impact, you're going to be addressing some of the Sustainable Development Goals. If you're making your design affordable and accessible, or if you're having a particular kind of business model, that could help with accessibility and inclusivity and leave no one behind. So it's not just those two, these are really relevant across the board. So I hope that gives you a brief introduction, but on to the good stuff. I'm going to ask our speakers to introduce themselves. And if you're happy, Kate, I'll start with you.
Great. It's a real pleasure to join all of you today. My name is Kate Roll. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London, UCL. I'm also affiliated with the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. I'm a political scientist by training, although a lot of my work currently connects to sustainability, food systems transformation, systems thinking, and some questions around SDGs and taxation, and SDGs and measurement. So very happy to be speaking with you all about the SDGs from sort of a big zoomed out perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. It's great to have you. And over to Sheree. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks. Thank you, Kate, for the introduction. I am Sheree Conibear, and I'm the M&E manager. So I'm the monitoring and evaluation manager on the Layer program, in which the design challenge falls under. So you'll be able to reach out to me at any time and get my support and ask any questions you need during the lifetime of your design and while you're working on your concept notes, and I'll be involved in reviewing some of the concept notes, etc. So I am a resource that's available at any time to support you. And then also that also links into the SDGs, because our overall program works towards also bridging the gap on some of these SDGs. So I've been with the Layer program for almost 4 years now, and I've seen 3 rounds of the design challenge. So I'm happy to support you all, and reach out at any time through Rachel, even after this presentation. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Sheree. That's a really kind offer. I'm sure people will appreciate and make use of that. Wonderful. So now we've done introductions. Let me change the slides and hand over to Kate.
Great, thank you. And you know what? If I can share my screen, then it means I can progress the slides. Should we do it that way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so
Yeah.
great. Just makes it a little bit easier. Great. Is everyone seeing my screen okay? Is that like okay, Rachel?
Yeah, looks great.
Super. So like I said with my introduction, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the SDGs and try to get a little bit of a deeper dive into the SDGs as a document, as a attempt to bring change, and sort of using my point of view as a political scientist to talk about them in that way. So I'll give a little bit of overview, and then I'll raise sort of a few particular questions that are worth considering as we sort of lift up the hood a bit. So I'll do a brief introduction to the SDGs. I'll talk a little bit about their evolution, so where they came from. And then I'll talk about some challenges that we think about when we think about the SDGs in practice, and thinking critically about sustainable development and what that means. I'm going to start my timer now, though, so because I can talk about this for hours, so I'll try to limit myself to about 20 minutes. So the first thing to know, and I think most of you guys should be familiar with this, is that the SDGs are composed of 17 high-level goals. Below these goals sit 169 targets, where they go into more specificity about what it takes to achieve that goal. And then we've got over 230 indicators that tell us if we're moving towards those targets, which of course then move towards the goals. So they've got the sort of simple grid that you see always, but under that sits quite a lot of more specific work and more specific ideas about measurement. They were adopted by all UN member states in 2015, and they're considered soft international law in the sense that there is a widespread commitment to pursuing the SDGs, but if a member state does not, pursue them fully or does not achieve a certain level, that there's no stick. There's only carrots for this. There's no sort of repercussions to not achieving the SDGs. So it's an agreement, it's a commitment, but it's not enforceable. And it's, the aim, the goal is to form a comprehensive and consensus view of the future. The idea is that these are 17 goals that we can really agree on, that we can come around, and that can unite not only actors from lots of different countries, all the member states, but also can organize funders, can organize activists, can help to sort of get everyone on the same page and agreeing about what's important and what the future needs to look like. That's particularly important when we get to these targets and indicators. So this slide is not so much for you to be able to read this fine text, but to give a sense that the SDGs didn't just come out of nowhere, right? The SDGs are a product of almost 30 years, 3 decades plus of advocacy. And there's, some people go even further back to the birth of the environmental movement, or there's multiple birthplaces of multiple environmental movements. But if we're thinking about things like Silent Spring in the United States, where there's growing concern about industrial agriculture and pesticides, and that starting ecological movements, environmental movements in that place. And then we've got a very important milestone, the Earth Summit in Brazil, the 1992 Earth Summit in Brazil. And And these different strains, often influenced around sustainability and environment, coming together towards the goals in 2015. So you're seeing lots of different sets of agreements, whether the Sendai Disaster Risk Reduction Framework or the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, sort of sitting under and connecting into the goals. The most important precursor of the SDGs, though, were the Millennium Development Goals. So these were developed in 2000, and as you can see, they're much simpler. So instead of having 17 goals, we had 8 goals. Again, this idea that these were supposed to be about priority setting, simple, measurable, consensus-based, but they were different from the SDGs in some really important ways. The first was that they're really about the aid agenda. So about where funders, where international organizations should be putting their money and putting their energy, and where we should be tracking progress. So it had a very north-south or industrialized into emerging economy or industrializing economy focus. So only low-income countries, for example, would be measured against these. We weren't using these to direct policy in the UK, for example. So it had a north-south aid agenda piece to it. And, you know, scholars who come out of critical development studies, you know, say that the MDGs were part of sort of understanding the role of the UN in the post-Cold War world. You know, we no longer have this big sort of bipolar world. What's the point of the UN? What's it doing? Well, it's moving towards addressing these really important problems, and we're going to orient around these 8 core areas of focus. So it has a politics to it. But the MDGs weren't universally loved. A lot of the ideas were focused on sort of a basic needs view of extreme poverty. So, you know, sometimes we get, you know, a basic needs view of something like hunger is that people need, you know, 12,000 calories a day. And if they get 12,000 calories a day, that's fine and we can move on. Whereas people who take sort of a more holistic view will say, actually, you know, food is tied to culture, food is tied to the economy. It's not just about, and different people have different caloric needs. If we think about Amartya Sen's work. And so, you know, a critique comes out of this sort of basic needs view. There's also concern that it wasn't very systematic. You know, not so much concerned with economic systems and inequality, and there wasn't so much around human rights or institutional reforms. Just this idea that the 8 were really good, but they're not really taking this sort of more systems view. And then the drafting was also highly criticized, and because it was really centered with the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, with very limited consultation. And so, you know, people made fun of the MDGs, people rejected them, lots of critical work came out of that. Major distracting gimmick was what one critic called it, but it was a starting place. It was sort of the seed for what we now know as the SDGs. So with the SDGs, we see some evolution from the MDGs. We see a widened scope of the goals. So we more than double the number. We have a more systemic and institutional view of poverty and inequality. So they're interested in institutions, rule of law, peace and security, all these things that weren't included in the MDGs. Much, you know, and a result, we see much greater number of goals and indicators. We also see that the SDGs apply equally to all UN member states. It's not just an aid agenda about what needs to be done in low-income countries or in countries under stress. It's something that should be happening everywhere, which I think is a really important change of sort of stance. And then, you know, the frustration with the MDGs coming out of the UN Secretary General's office, that the SDGs were really driven by much more consultative process. It had multiple streams. And the real important drivers were environmental ministers from middle-income countries, particularly in Latin America. So you've got a different set of actors that came together to do this. Yeah, here we go. So this is just a little insight into this consultative process. So again, we need to be thinking in these long time frames. So we have 2011 to 2015 is when the formal process was running. But even before that, there were discussions about what comes after the MDGs. There were open working groups and lots of participation. The open working group, I think it's important to note, had particularly 8 target groups. So women, youth, Indigenous people, NGOs, local authorities, workers and unions, business industries, science and technology, and farmers. So it really made a real focused effort on crowding in these different points of view in order to develop the goals. Of course, still lots of back and forth, not an easy process. So, the SDGs landed in 2015, were adopted across member states, but they, again, weren't universally loved at the start. I think this idea that, everyone agrees on the SDGs, we have to remember that they were, there was controversy, there was rejection at the start, that still continues. So we have some important publications, op-eds in important publications like Foreign Policy and The Economy, that The Economist, that actually, really rejected the SDGs. Although I think, The Economist probably wouldn't, go by that wouldn't publish that op-ed now. I think there's been a real shift. Okay, so now I'm just going to go into, after, I've talked a little bit about the history of the SDGs, I'm going to talk about sort of what they mean in practice. So like I said, 17 goals, 169 targets, and 232 indicators. This is the image that we always see with the SDGs. But like I said, it's really important to sort of lift up the hood and actually look at those targets and indicators. And the best way to do that is to literally download a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet from UN Stats that has these the targets and indicators. And you can say, okay, what is sitting under, so SDG 5 on gender equity, how is that being conceptualized? What are the targets that were agreed upon? Because it's not loosey-goosey. It's not that anything that helps women is counted as in the targets and indicators. They actually are specific ones that the SDGs are asking governments to pursue and track. And so here's an example of thinking about gender equity and the importance of enabling technology. So including ICTs, information communications technology. And so that's the target. And then one of the indicators being the proportion of individuals who own a mobile phone by sex. And I think this is an interesting example, both because it shows that when we're thinking about gender equity, we're having to prioritize what are the targets. We're thinking about interesting things like access to technology. But when we get down to something like how do we actually measure it, we're measuring something like mobile phone ownership. And we need to be thinking critically about, is that the best way to be operationalizing or measuring this target? What are the alternatives as time changes and mobile phone ownership becomes more and more universal? Are there other pieces that we should be looking at? So, when you start, again, lifting up the hood, looking at these actual targets and indicators, it raises a lot of questions that scholars and practitioners are really grappling with. SDG indicators look at inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. I won't go into this too much, but it's a mix of questions of things like, what proportion of women have mobile phones, but also, do we see changes in certain things? So the reduction of the rate of non-communicable diseases might be something that would be an impact versus something like how many nurses are trained per year might be an output that's also measured. So it's a mix of different ways of measuring within those targets and indicators, or within the indicators. And, again, we are always thinking critically. It's really important to be able to measure things, but once you start to measure something, once you put an indicator on it, you can have some distortions that enter. So there's some really interesting, again, critical scholarship that have looked at the challenges around measurement. One of the classic critiques of the Millennium Development Goals was that there was a target around increasing school attendance. And so there was a lot of measurement of number of bums in seats. But when people went and sort of looked at what was actually happening, there might be kids in school, but was there a teacher at the front of the room, right? So when you're measuring something, you might be measuring one thing that may seem important, but are you actually capturing what we really care about, which is something like learning, right? We don't actually care if the kid is in school, if there's not a teacher, if learning isn't happening, but measuring something that's challenging like learning, that's much more difficult to quantify. Or if you were going to do something like a literacy test, that's very time consuming to measure. So lots of questions around measurement. Okay. So just to wrap up, I think there's some interesting pieces around, thinking about the politics of the SDGs, how they interact, how they drive change, and a few notes about context. So I'm just going to move through these points quite quickly. Again, these are just to have you thinking critically about the SDGs and how they work in practice. So, like I emphasized, the SDGs didn't come down from nowhere, and they're a product of a political process. And so there were always challenges to what would be included and what would not be included. And so a lot of the conversations that are going on right now about what happens after the SDGs are about what are the things that were left out, maybe because there was too much contestation around it. So things like language and culture or gay rights, those things weren't included. Should those be included? What would they look like? So we've got, this is a political process, and the SDGs reflect this negotiation. And there's hot topics or things that are controversial that weren't included. So we always have to think about the SDGs as political in terms of their authorship. And then also where governments, where firms invest money around the SDGs is not even. So we have that nice grid where everything looks the same size, but we see different amount of resources and attention being spent on different SDGs. So it's not sort of an even distribution of attention. So health, for example, climate and energy receive a lot of attention, whereas things like institutions, peace and land, so SDG 16 receive much less attention. So how these become adopted and put into practice, again, reflects the political context. Moving on, because I'm going to just keep cracking on. The SDGs are in some ways like sustainable development itself, where they're potentially contradictory. How do you do something that is resource intensive, potentially like development, raising people's standard of living, giving them access to food and water and medicines, while also being sustainable, i.e. thinking about the impact on future generations. And so we see these potential contradictions between SDGs. So where we're thinking about, often around consumption. So protecting land, protecting water, while also, providing good work, providing access to resources, right? There's tensions between these. So this example is talking about water and land use targets and how they interact with things like hunger and the need to intensify agriculture in certain areas. There's really great scholarship on this. This is a table where the Fader looked at the interactions between clean water, affordable energy, and hunger, and basically coded them as either reinforcing, where progress on one goal would enable progress on another goal, and then the ones that are in pink are where there's constraining, where maybe intensifying agriculture production actually would decrease the likelihood that we're able to put important land into conservation. So we've got some really interesting tensions even within the SDGs that are worth considering in your work. And finally, and maybe I should have started here, is that how SDGs drive change is not actually totally straightforward, because we're in a situation of this soft international law. So, how do you get governments to do something when it can't be enforced. And so, how do you create change? How do you do governance without government, right? These really classic international relations questions. And so the core audiences for SDGs are policymakers, citizens, funders, and aid agencies. And we're interested in, inspiring folks, changing what they think is important, mobilizing civil society, engaging media, right? It's a lot about saying, this is what we've agreed. Let's help with policy prioritization and target setting, right? So in that, I'll jump a little bit. I think that we can think about it in two ways. One is normative change. So the SDGs are a statement of values, a statement of purpose, of what's important. And so, let's orient our actions around that. It's a normative change, shared expectations about what is right. And SDGs provide some language and momentum for policies that may be floundered. Oh no, my internet. Yeah. For policies that maybe hadn't progressed to be legitimized and move forward. But there's also methodological changes that come in with the SDGs, where governments are being asked to report. And so it brings attention to maybe things that they weren't tracking. And it also allows for comparison across different geographies. So you can know, how are we doing in the UK compared to France or compared to Germany, right? It allows for that kind of competition, which might inspire, again, political action or civil society action. And I'm just coming to the end of my time, but the final thing I wanted to raise is that, maybe a final tension in the SDGs is they're written in a way that all countries can get on board and that the targets and indicators would be relevant to all countries. But that's very, very hard to do because you're talking about super high income countries and low income countries. You're talking about very large countries with rural populations, and you're talking about, city states like Singapore. You're trying to cover a huge amount of different contexts. And so while the SDGs try to get us onto the same page, there's also been an increased conversation about localization. So how do you take these goals and then reinterpret them for the local context? So the SDGs talk a lot about youth, but when I did work in Spain, the concern was less on youth as on aging populations. And what is, aging and the elderly are a bigger development concern in Spain than necessarily youth. And so how do you localize, how do you take these goals and then fit them to your needs? Of course, the question that raises is if everyone is rewriting the goals to meet their local context, do we still then have working around the same goals, right? So these are these sort of tensions that come into play when we're working on such a big and important project. You see really interesting, this is an example from South Africa, where there's work to align the National Development Plan to the SDGs. And you see similar things in the UK, in different places where they take, their priorities and then fit them to the SDGs or pick target SDGs for increasing alignment. And so those are some of the sort of strategies used for aligning and localizing. So finally, that's, I just wanted to sort of raise some little fire starters for you all to be thinking about. So the politics of the SDGs, the interaction within the 17 SDGs, how we expect them and want them to drive change as non-binding agreement. And then this question of context and localization, always the push-pull between universalism and then the need for things to be local and specific. So, if we have more time in the discussion, I'd be really interested to hear other tensions or questions that the SDGs raise. And what do you think are the greatest challenge, both for practitioners and for the SDG project overall? So there we go. So the SDGs have a history. They're contested. They're imperfect. They're part of a political project. They've got ideas about how the world should work. And, they're working in a really important methodological and normative way to drive change. And you guys are all part of that by engaging with these and bringing them into your thinking as you design your projects. So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate. That was a wonderful, really interesting presentation, and thank you for yeah, it was really clear, and it was great to hear something about the tensions between them as well as the interactions, and encouraging us to be critical about the Sustainable Development Goals, and some fantastic points and kind of questions that students can take away and think about. I think one thing to say is we do ask you to show how your design is addressing the Sustainable Development Goals, but that doesn't mean that you can't be critical of them as well and bring in some of these tensions and recognition of that in your work too. So thank you very much, Kate. Let's move on. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but we'll move to Sheree's presentation now. So let me just share my screen.
I think maybe Rachel, if I share as well, because I've got some like presentation mode slides.
Sure.
Let's see if I can. If it's not that possible, then it might not be. Can you see my slides?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go into presentation mode. Let's see. Can you see them now?
We still see them. We're not seeing the presentation mode though just yet.
This is where sometimes it's not. Maybe you can put them into presentation mode for me then. That would be, would that be possible?
I'll share mine, shall I?
Okay.
Yeah. Is that good?
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheree.
Right. Okay. So it's great to see so many students on the call. That's one positive feedback today. And we're going to talk about Leave No One Behind. So how Leave No One Behind is integrated into all the SDGs that we have. So no matter what SDG you're working on, there's an opportunity for you to think about Leave No One Behind and think about how to integrate that as part of your thinking in your designs and in your projects, and especially that the projects that we work on cover poverty related, energy access, and also working across sub-Saharan Africa and some of the regions in Asia, so where people need support the most. If we can go to the next slide. Next one. Okay, so Leave No One Behind was a transformative promise in 2023 as part of the Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. And it represents the commitment of the UN member states of how we are going to eradicate poverty. So thinking about not only how we eradicate poverty, but also of those who are left behind for various reasons, which can be all different. And I think, just as Kate said, like there's not one SDG that we can take on and develop equally across every single country. It depends on what needs that country has. It depends on what their challenges are. You might have an SDG that focuses, as Kate said, on in one country on the younger generation, where another country the issues are the older generation. So there's not one size that fits all. It's the same for Leave No One Behind. So when we're thinking about putting that into place, we have to keep thinking, who are those left behind and why, and what is the context, and how far along is that country developed and where the gaps are. So that's what we have to think about. So there's all different forms of reasons why people are left behind, and for us to enable us to eradicate poverty, it's most important to think about those who are left behind, those who are marginalized, those who are minorities, those who, and it could be different in one country. They could not be minorities. In other countries they could be minorities. So it's thinking about the context of your design and who are those that are left behind around your design, your work, your technologies, and what you're focusing on. So that's why Leave No One Behind was brought into the context of Sustainable Development Goals, because we can't eradicate poverty if some people are left behind and other people are moving up the value chain and improving, and then we're leaving. We want to bring everybody up to the same level, or as we're moving certain people up different levels of the value chain, we have to move the rest up as well. So that's what we have to think about. And that's what we think about when we design our technologies. We think about if access to electricity or to efficient appliances, getting people more access. But who are those that are left behind, and why are they left behind, depending on your context? So if you're working on a health project, why are some of those left behind in your context? If you're working on an education project, why are some of those left? And it'll differ depending on the technology, the context, the country, wherever your project is and what you're working on. You could be in the same country, but within the villages that you're working on to support, it will differ from the capital of that country, where people might be much more developed. It might not be those left behind. So that's why Leave No One Behind is really important to support us thinking about the SDGs, and each SDG, who is left behind and why. And then, so not only reaching out to think about the poorest of people, but also thinking about discrimination. Those who are left behind because there's a discrimination towards them. So what are those inequalities that mean that these people are left behind? So it could be gender discriminations, and I'd seen on Kate's slides one of them that was Saudi Arabia's issue with people that had left behind because their culture does not accept certain people in how they present themselves or their gender, etc. So that's what we have to think about. So if you think about what are some of these equalities, I just listed some here quite fast. So some of the things that we have is people are at different levels of poverty. So one interesting fact for me is when I went to work in Uganda and we were looking at the poorest of people, some people said to me, well, actually in Uganda, behind poverty is more poverty. So there's another large gap where there's people left behind, even further behind poverty. So different levels of income means that people are left behind because they don't have access. And that's what we're looking at when we're designing technologies. Who are the people that are left behind, and we need to support them because they don't have access to electricity, or they can't pay pay-go, or they can't access services. So how is our technology going to support some of those people to lift them out of poverty? Some of the equalities could be in different opportunities. It could be in transport and where you are. People are in hard to reach areas and they're left behind because they can't reach certain services. So your technology might be focusing on getting people access. So why are these people left behind? Why do they not have transport? Is it financially? Is it the roads? Is it? So it's thinking about all these different inequalities and why they're there. It could be access to education. Some people get left behind because they're not as educated. They don't get so many opportunities, and it's also linked to poverty. It could be they have learning difficulties. So I can give you a very good example that is very close to my heart, which is one of my children has a learning difficulty and is not easy accessing jobs as other people would be because of those opportunities. So it's looking at equality and equity. So it's not fair. Why are they left behind? So does your technology also that you're developing in your concept now, does it look at people with learning difficulties? Can they access that technology if they have learning difficulties? Are you going to make it accessible to those who have different difficulties, whether it's access through walking to different locations or using, for example, we had a project that looked at solar water pumps and people who can't walk and they can still use solar water pumps. So I was thinking about those different disabilities or learning difficulties and bringing them together in making sure they're not left behind. It could be health, access to health services. People don't have access. And it doesn't mean because there's not a centre nearby. It could mean that they're people that are displaced and cannot access these services because they're displaced or refugees. So are they part of your group that you're thinking about within part of your technology? It could be food security. People don't have access to food and others do. Employment is a big, huge issue that we have in terms of inequality. So all of these result in people being left behind: housing, access to different resources, gender-based discrimination, religious, culture, race, legal status. People who are within a country they're living in do not get all of the services that people in refugees camps do. So it's thinking about all of these different inequalities and thinking about, are they, when you create your design, who are the people in your design that are around you and have these inequalities, and how can you make that accessible? So we have to think about leave behind from our design phase. Bringing it in later is quite difficult because you've already done your concept and already thought about your design. So it's very difficult later on to have your design think, oh, well, my design is not accessible for people who don't have transport within the location that I'm in. 70% of people can't get to the places that they need to access. So you have to think about that early on. Right, I should go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to sort of be a little bit more practical because Kate gave us all of the information that was based on scientific facts and all the great knowledge that she had. So I wanted to be a little bit more practical in terms of what we consider when we put in our project, when we do our projects. So within our design phase, when you're designing your concept and when you're writing it up and when I'm reviewing some of these concept notes, we want to see who are the beneficiaries. So you're creating a technology, but who are you creating this for in your concept note? Who are these beneficiaries? Are they men? Are they women? Who else is in the community that you've left behind and not thought about including as part of that design as well? So have we included everybody within that geographic location that we're aiming to impact? When you think about a concept, and if you're thinking of designing something related to cooling or something related to agriculture, think about the location that you want your technology to be in. We don't want to think too big and say our technology is going to be sold all around the world. Let's think about what we're designing right now. Who are the people around this location? Are they rural farmers? Are they urban? Is there people with disabilities? The geographic location, the age. So sometimes we see there's lots of issues with, I can speak a little bit about myself, like with all the new apps and technology, not everybody at the same, in the same age group of understanding how to work something through an app or have that knowledge. So how much awareness do we have to raise? How much learning do we have to do within our concept note when we're designing it? And the second point is thinking about the research phase. So make sure you do some research as well. So we're never reinventing the wheel from scratch. We're never inventing something that hasn't been included. So let's do some research on this technology or this concept. Has it been done before? Is it being used? What are the benefits? Can we improve? Are we creating something new? Are we improving on something that already exists? Who accesses it? So if we're talking about maybe a small refrigerator for vaccines, so that means I need to look at NGOs and I have to look at people in the healthcare sector. Am I looking at solar water pumps? Then I have to look at farmers in private and public sector that are supporting farmers. So think about where the design is, where it sits within the whole context, and think about doing some research and some background, because that's where you get your baseline data from. And you see if it's worth something pursuing and designing a concept note. Do a little bit of a deep dive on it before, so you can have data and collect data. You might find out that this concept note or technology is actually used 80% by women who are in rural sectors. So you think about 80%, that means 30%, 70%, then 30% are left behind. Why are they left behind? How can I improve this concept to include the 30% are left behind? Who are they? So gathering that baseline data, so much data is available online. So much data is available online. And if not, you can reach out and send out emails to different people, and people are happy to share with you that information when they know the purpose of what you're doing. So it's good to see that you have that thought process in and include it in your concept note, that we have a research phase, because we're going to look at how many people are left behind. We're going to do a deep dive. We're going to collect data on how many people have access. So include all that in that concept note. It supports your concept note and supports it, bringing it to life and making the idea more acceptable or brings it to life, knowing that this is something that can be achieved or has been, and this is how you're going to improve it. And then make a list of all those people who have come out of your research who have not been included and how you're going to include them. Think about it. I remember we had a project going back in our E3 research team, which was at a very high level. It's not at the design challenge level, but they thought about cookers for people who are blind, and they thought about different technologies for people to be able to turn them on and turn them off, these solar cookers, if they had certain disabilities. So think about always including those who don't have access, because sometimes when you think about long-term, when your sales market, there's actually more people that need things that don't have access than the variety of things that are out there that you can purchase that people have access to. And then another important one is the unintended consequences. So sometimes people are left behind unintentionally. So you don't plan to leave people behind, but they are. And I'll give you an example on this. I was working on a project in Kenya when we were working with the British government, and they were trying to improve roads to make them more efficient for people to transport food, to people who didn't have food, to people who didn't have access. But along that road, there were the poorest of women who used to sell their food, sell some clothes they used to make, sell some dairy products, have some goat and sheep. But when the road was transformed into a major road and it went under work for 2 years, those women were left behind, so they didn't have income. So also think when you do your research of who are those that will be left behind unintentionally, and they might be some of your targets to include in your design. So that's a really good place to think about. Who are the people that are left behind intentionally and unintentionally? How can we support them? So look at those, and they are usually in reports. You find them in the challenges or the gaps, and you see that that's the opportunity to think, oh, I can help these people with my design. And the last one is bridging the gap on SDG 7. So there's so many SDGs, and leave no one behind can be included in health, in education, in law, in policy. But we are working on the layer program looking at SDG 7. So we want more people to have access to efficient appliances so they can prove their income and not be left behind. So think about how we can get people who don't have access more access, and think about those who are left behind and they don't have access to electricity and efficient appliances. We can move on now. Yeah, so SDG 7, which is affordable and clean energy. And it doesn't mean we're only focusing on SDG 7, because when we're looking at how many people have affordable access to clean energy, it's also the poorest people. So it's another SDG, which is no poverty. And then it's also, it could be like solar water pumps or cooling machines. Then we're looking at also water. So that's another SDG. So all the SDGs are interlinked. But for our design, we want to think also about sort of the main focus of making sure that our design focuses on affordability, reliability, sustainability, so everyone has more affordable access to clean energy. And that sort of almost drags other SDGs behind it, because those who can't afford are people who are poor. Those who can't afford are people who are left behind. Those who can't afford. So some of our projects, we work in schools as well to provide cooking. So that's also food, and that's also education. And so all of the SDGs are interlinked. So think about these SDGs, and it's good to have in your concept note sort of a few lines on your SDGs and thinking about the research that you've done around that. Next one. Yeah, so I think as Kate mentioned, there are so many indicators, I think 200 and something I caught. So you can think about looking at that the SDGs that you think might be aligned to your project, but then go into this, so many SDG websites in the UNSD website, and then you can go a little bit of deep dive into the indicators that are underneath. And you can think about which ones of my project we're designing concept notes. So no one's saying to you that you need to, let's see the first one, make sure that everybody from your concept has universal access to modern energy. You're not setting targets, but you could think about which ones your design is aligned to, and then include that within your concept note and say, well, my design is gonna help improve the energy efficiency. So you can choose that one and elaborate more and read up a little bit about it and link it to your design. Or you could be working on a technology and research that is going to support like investments in the clean energy. So just think about which ones, go a little bit deeper into your SDGs and pull out which ones are more linked. And then think about, well, if I'm improving efficiency, doubling the efficiency, who are those that don't have any efficient appliances? Why are they left behind? How can they get access to efficient energy? How can we double their efficiency? Keep going back to that point of those who are left behind and think about which indicators within the SDGs you think you're aligned to. You don't have to report results, but are you aligned to? Your concept note is aligned to. Go to the next slide. Okay, this is just a little drawing of mine. I thought it might be useful, even though it's not as fancy as it should. When you're designing your concept note, think about the bigger picture. So this is what I usually actually do in a workshop, is we draw this big circle and we think about my technology. For example, this one is a little house. Let's say this is a walk-in cold room. And then who needs access to this within my small community? Draw the borders of your community. So the towns that you're working on. Women, is it in the community? Is it family? Is it children? Is it elderly? Is it who are in those communities? You can actually get these statistics and numbers to know who is in those communities to set your baselines. Then think about the inequalities within that community. So are there displaced people within those communities? Are there refugees within those communities? How can we also include them in our concept? So you have your concept here, then you have the community, then you have people who are displaced. But in another community, it could look different for each one of you. So you could maybe be working on technology that's not suitable for children, so they wouldn't be in your little bubble of what you're thinking about. And then you might not have people who are refugees. You might have a large number of people who have disabilities within your community. So they're the ones that are outside that you need to bring them in. And then when you bring them in, you think about your technology in terms of how are these people going to use the technology? If you can see in the circle down the bottom, is it accessible to all of these people? All the people that are in your community and the ones that are left behind. You think about the efficiency. Can they all afford it? Is it affordable? If it's not affordable for all, how can we make it affordable for all? There's pay-goes, there's loans, there's reducing the cost, looking for alternatives. Is there supply and demand from everybody on this technology? Is there awareness? Sometimes people are left behind because they're not aware. Sometimes there's elderly people who are not aware, people who are not educated, so they get left behind because they're not part of the trend of these new technologies and they're not aware that they can benefit from them. So it's just thinking about the bigger picture and who is not in that bubble that you're focusing on. Why are they not? And what do we need to do to get them to be and get them included? So it's having that wider thought process. There we go. Okay. So because you're at a concept note phase, I didn't want to go too much into like creating indicators because we're not measuring impact at this level. We're thinking about your design. So it's more about thinking about inclusivity of your design, thinking about the quality of your design. So sort of tick indicators instead of ticking targets. Say, is the quality of my design inclusive? Yes, because you've thought about people who are disincluded and how you're including them. You're thinking about those who don't have access and why they don't have access. Is my design easy to use? Is it accessible? Is it not? How can I make it accessible for everyone? Because that's how you're not leaving people behind. Is it hard to use? Is it easy to use? Can people with minimum knowledge operate it? Do they need training manuals? Do they need training videos? So how can we make it accessible to everyone so no one is left behind? So it's sort of thinking about all those different things: ease of use, accessibility, control, visualization, communication, different languages, and it'll differ from project to project. It'll differ from concept note to concept note. And next one. I just added in some extra notes here that I pulled off the framework, which is for Leave No One Behind, so Rachel can share it with you. And they're sort of ticking boxes and thinking about different inequalities of discrimination, equality, equity, etc. And there's also another slide. So it's good for you to have a read through and think about those who are left behind and why they're left behind and what data we need to gather so it helps us include them in and not be at the risk of eliminating them out of our design. I think, yeah, that's me, Rachel.
Thanks, Sheree. That was a great presentation with lots of kind of actions that people can take away and questions to consider about their design. So I think your presentations complemented each other really well. Thank you both. Let's move on to the Q&A. We don't have much time left, but let's open the floor. And I don't know if Kate and Sheree, if you need to drop off, but if you could stay a few minutes, that would be amazing so we can get some questions. Great, thank you. So if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand or just come off mute. There's some really interesting presentations, so hopefully you've had a think and you have some questions to ask. Anybody? And we don't have silly questions, so don't be shy, please. I think if you're thinking it, someone else is probably thinking it. So do go ahead and ask. Someone's asking in the chat, can we get the slides, please? Yes, of course. I will be sharing those after. You will find them on CrowdSolve in the events forum in the post about this webinar by the end of today.
Maybe I can just add one thing also just on resources, because I've seen a question on resources. There are so many toolkits online for Leave No One Behind and for SDGs. And there's also companies that have implemented these toolkits, and you can see how they filled them in. And that could be something useful to do on a small scale and have a look at some of these toolkits that have already been designed. And it sort of says in the toolkit, this is what we're looking to include in terms of leave no one behind. These are the steps, these are the findings. So they're very useful toolkits if you want to integrate it more into your design. Just have a read of a few toolkits that are already developed. We're not reinventing the wheel. There's a lot of information out there, and you can even link it to your design. Toolkits on cooling technologies, toolkits on health projects, etc.
Great, thanks, Sheree. Do we have any questions? Oh, great. We've got one in the chat from Rosemary who says, is it okay to focus on a certain category of the underprivileged in the Leave No One Behind system?
So I think there's not going to be one technology or one idea that's going to fit everyone. But it'd be useful to think about if you are focusing on a certain category, how many more categories you can include. And those who are not included in that category, why are they not included? Is it because the technology doesn't suit them? Is it that there's just a few things that you can change to include more people? So we can include it because definitely there's technologies that focus only on people who have the disability of, they don't have the vision, or they have disability in walking. So there are technologies designed just for them. But then we can think about who else can we include, and just list those who are not included and think, why are they not included? Can they be or not? But definitely we can't include everybody into everything, because otherwise we only need one project to include everyone. So there are definitely different projects and technologies for different people who are left behind for different reasons. And there's also different organizations and projects that focus on only refugees or only people who are displaced or only people who have healthcare issues. So normally we're not going to find one technology that fits everyone. So yes, you can focus on certain people only underprivileged for a certain reason, but think about those who are not and why you've not included them.
Great, thanks, Sheree. I think that was a really good question, a really important point. So glad you asked that. Thanks, Rosemary. We have one from Simbarashi. Are we supposed to be using data collection tools, maybe surveys, as it is almost not so meaningful to use questionnaires and interviews?
So I think that's in terms of them developing their concept notes. So I think when we're developing our concept notes, we're not at the stage of we're getting ready to implement. So we wouldn't need or even have maybe the efficient resources to go out and do large surveys. But there are surveys that have been done and you can collect the data from. You can collect data from local councils. You can collect data from the E4A website and from different NGOs that are focusing on that. And you could write out a few questions and send them to a few different areas asking for data. Write a few questions out and send the same questions to 10 different organizations and collect data. But I think you could do a survey if you had the finances and the resources. But I think since the concept notes are like quite early stages, I don't think that it would collecting or doing a deep dive in a desk research of what's available to include in your concept note would be more sufficient at this early stage.
Yeah, I think that's true. And later on, you might choose to do some primary research, and that could really add value to your project, and maybe in a more qualitative sense than quantitative, but desk-based research can be really good for that quantitative research. But we do really like to see that you've done that research and that you've got that data to back up what you're saying. I think that's really important. It's easy to say, some big sweeping statement, which probably is true, but if you've got that data to back you up, that's really kind of adds impact and shows that you've done your research and you understand the area you're addressing. So another great question, thank you. Adango says, thank you, Kate and Sheree, for the insightful presentation. Even the pay-as-you-go model to make technology accessible to more people is still expensive for majority of people in developing countries. Are there other better models available to ensure we leave no one behind? Great question.
So I think that's really important. And it's something that we think about all the time, because the poorest of people don't have access to pay-go in the companies, don't loan out loans to people who they think cannot pay. I'm so sorry for that. So there are so many people left behind because of this. And this is actually an issue that I raise quite often. I know that Rachel, in one of our spotlights, mattered and her piece on pay-go options and what are all the different options that can include different people. So there are different pay-go models. There's pay as you go, there's pay as you grow. So after people grow and sell their crops, they pay back. There's so many different models. And I think people are becoming more aware of, and companies also are becoming more aware that there's so many more opportunity and people that don't have access. So creating models that allow them to be able to pay back. So that is becoming something that we see more. And I think if you could share that spotlight, Rachel, with them, that would be very useful. The one that Matt had done. So it could be like what we've seen in some countries on solar water pumps. We've seen 3-4 farmers and they have one contract where they share the same technology instead of one person taking out the whole amount. So there are different models that are available. Unfortunately, there are categories that are still left behind. And sometimes those are the ones that need to be reached through aid and support in humanitarian access to technologies. But there are models created and being created. So Rachel will share that spotlight with you, and it's really an important point.
Yeah, thanks, Adango. One of the ones that Sheree mentioned there was pay by produce. So that would be potentially useful for agricultural settings where an appliance can help a farmer or producer grow their produce, and then they can pay with that produce that they have used the appliance to achieve. So yeah, but really good considerations, and as Sheree was saying, not everything is going to be perfect for everyone, but great question. I'm conscious of time. I don't want to keep people too long. So just one more in the chat, and Adango's raised their hand. I'll just do the one in the chat first, and then perhaps this is the last two questions. Thank you for staying behind. So Yvonne says, what if your project focuses on the cooperative? Can that match in leaving no one behind?
So what do we mean by cooperative? Are we talking about a shop or a store, or is that what is meant?
I think we might mean where a group of people come together in cooperation to buy and use or lease and use an appliance. I think, Yvonne, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was my interpretation.
So if we're looking at it from the corporate lens and from the suppliers and companies that are selling, they should be able to think about different categories of people and what they can afford, and have different packages and pay-go models to suit different people. So that is the option. If we're thinking about people who have like another example that I've come across is a walk-in cold room where people store their fruit and veg, but there's farmers that sell crops that are less profitable. So they are the poorest of farmers, whereas you have farmers who have large land and they store mangoes and they make a lot of profit. So we're thinking about models of people who can pay less, then they can also store, but they can get a different package other than those who can pay more pay more expensive. So we're also thinking about it, and it's thinking about what's important here and comes into mind is equity. Not everyone is able to have the same accessibility and also to pay the same equally. So we have one model, but we have to think about how we can make it accessible to different people so that we're not leaving anyone behind. So I think it can be, and it should be at the corporate level as well. At the cooperative level, sorry.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, a cooperative can definitely match with leaving no one behind. I think that can help people spread the cost between themselves, so that if somebody for one reason or another doesn't have the budget or the resources at a particular time, they can share that cost and then perhaps input more at a different time. So the questions that Sheree raised on the slides are going to be really helpful for thinking through like how a cooperative can help include some people who would typically or might typically be left behind, and also whether and who is still being excluded, because as we're saying, it's not possible to make it perfect for everyone. Okay, Kate needs to go. Thank you so much, Kate, for being with us, and I'm so sorry to go over, but I think this was really, really valuable, and yeah, really appreciate you giving your time. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and good luck to everyone on your projects. These sound absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much, and take care.
Bye, Kate. Bye. Just if we have a minute left, Adango, you did have your hand raised, but you've put it down now. Do you still have a question?
Yes, but I think, thank you so much. Thanks, Cheryl and Kate. But I think you've answered my question, Rachel, in while you are summarizing the discussion from Sheree. That it's not possible to make it accessible to everyone, because I wanted to ask about the possibility, what government can do. All right, but I think that summarizes it. But then we'll try as much as possible to see how we make it accessible to a larger community.
Yeah.
Okay, but yeah, you said it just right. That it's not possible to make it available to everyone. Thank you.
Okay, great to hear that we answered those questions, and thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you for engaging and having so many great questions. That's really good that you're engaging with the topic and thinking about how it interacts with your project. So I hope you go away feeling excited and inspired and having some more ideas about your concept notes. I have a couple more slides which I'll talk through. Sheree, feel free to go. I know we've already gone over, but thank you so much for your time. And okay, just onto these quick final slides is just reminders from me. So please sign your terms and conditions if you haven't already done so. That enables me to contact you. You give us your email addresses and give us permission to contact you. And then I have a feedback survey. So you can head to the feedback survey after this and give some feedback on the webinar. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks to those of you who've already given feedback. It's really valuable to helping us improve. We want to do the best we can for you guys. So please give some feedback if you can spare the time. And that's all from me. I'm just going to pop those links in the chat so you've got them. As I've mentioned in the chat a couple of times, I will share the recording and I will share the slides with you all. And you can find those on CrowdSolve. So by the end of today, I will have put the recording and the slides on the CrowdSolve events forum on the post about this webinar. So you can see the link there. If you're having trouble, do reach out to me on the email or on CrowdSolve, but I won't be sending, I'm not intending to send out a big email with the recording and slides. They'll be on CrowdSolve. Okay, that's all from me. So I can hang around for a few minutes in case anyone has any questions on the topics. I can do my best to answer, or on the challenge in general, but otherwise, thank you so much for coming. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you at the next one, and have a great